Hello everyone, my name is Parsai. I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant. I'm also the author of 88 Tips on Immigration to Canada, which is a book that you can find on Amazon websites. One of the questions that my office receives probably on a daily basis, in fact sometimes multiple times in a single day, and I receive many questions and inquiries about that, is can I change my status from a visitor to a worker or to a student or to permanent residency? In fact, we run lots of seminars in Canada about this very topic. So I thought that maybe it's a good idea if I just spend session number 9 of our training series on this topic. So how to extend your stay in Canada or how to stay in Canada. Before I speak about that, let me explain to you that there is a difference between a visa and stay or permit. So when you have a visa, it means with the help of that visa, you can travel to Canada and enter Canada. Of course, subject to the decision of a border services officer. If you are from a visa-exempt country, you don't need a visa to come to Canada. You usually, with some exceptions like American citizens, you usually need an ETA or electronic travel authorization, which is a security clearance to be able to travel to Canada. If you are not from a visa-exempt country or you are not exempt from visas to Canada, then you apply for a visit visa and then they will attach a counterfoil in your passport, and then you will bring that with you, and the officer based on that allows you to enter Canada. So visa is for the purpose of crossing a port of entry and entering Canada. What about the stay or permit? It means the permission to stay in Canada. So sometimes you may have the permission to stay in Canada, but you don't have the permission to cross the border. Or in other words, if you leave Canada, you are not allowed to come back. An example would be somebody with a single entry visa. When you have a single entry visa, when you enter Canada, they may allow you to stay in Canada for a few months. But if you leave Canada before the number of days that they allowed you to stay in Canada, if you leave Canada, you cannot come back. There is one exception, and that exception is you just solely travel to the United States or to Saint-Pierre-en-Miquelon. With those exceptions, you cannot come back with that single entry visa because, as it is mentioned, it is a single entry visa. Or for example, if you have a multiple entry visa, and it's close to expiry of that multiple entry visa, you can enter Canada and they may allow you to stay here, for example, for 6 months. But because after a few weeks or a few days, that visa is not valid anymore, if you leave Canada, you cannot come back. So keep that in mind. There is a difference between visa and stay or permit. I have seen cases that a person had a permit and that permit was valid for a few months and they thought that they can leave Canada and come back, and that of course put them into huge trouble. Okay, so let's say you hold a visa or an ETA or you're a US citizen and then you cross the border. What happens? For how long can you stay in Canada? By default, you may stay as a visitor in Canada for a period of a maximum of 6 months. Okay? How do you know that? If the officer doesn't stamp your passport, or if they do stamp your passport but they do not mention an exit date, then it means that you can stay in Canada. I have seen many people that approach me frantically and say, I don't know for how long I can stay in Canada because the officer forgot to stamp my passport or forgot to mention a date that I need to leave Canada. And the simple answer is that because they allowed you to stay in Canada for a period of 6 months. So what if the officer decides to limit your stay and they say you may stay in Canada for less than 6 months or way more than 6 months? In those situations, the officer usually issues a piece of paper, and that paper is called a visitor record. On that visitor record, they clearly mention the validity of the visitor record or when you need to leave Canada. So if you enter Canada and the officer for some reason decides that you may stay in Canada for only 2 weeks, then they will issue you a visitor record, and on the visitor record they say that you need to leave Canada in less than 2 weeks. They usually put the date twice on that paper. So one is somewhere in the middle and one is on the bottom that says you have to leave Canada by such and such date. When you receive a visitor record, make sure to compare those two dates. There are no discrepancies between them. If there are, let the officer know to fix it on the spot for you. Of course, the same thing applies for when they want to go beyond 6 months. An example is that if you hold a work permit that is valid for 3 years and your spouse or common law partner or your minor children are accompanying you, at the port of entry, based on your work permit, you may request the Border Services officer to issue you a visitor record. If they agree, they will normally issue them visitor records that are valid for as long as your work permit is valid. So if your work permit is valid for 3 years, then the visitor records will be also valid for a period of 3 years. Okay? So that's the concept of visitor record. So what if you are in Canada and you approach the day that you need to leave Canada, but for some reason you want to stay for a long period of time? In this situation, you have some options. Option number one is to apply for an extension. The application for an extension is an online application. You may submit that application before the expiry of your stay in Canada. Okay, not visa, stay. So if your stay will expire 2 weeks from now, you can submit a request for an extension or submit an application for extension. If you go on IRCC website, they say submit this application at least 30 days from the expiry, but under the immigration regulations, you could even submit 1 day before the expiry. So that's not illegal, that's okay, okay? So you submit the application, and then when you submit the application, you just wait. Now, the application fee is $100. If you haven't done biometrics before, you also need to pay $85 for biometrics, and then wait. And you wait and wait. Now, if the date that your stay supposedly expires reaches and you pass that date, you shouldn't be worried because right now you have implied status. So for as long as you submitted your application for extension before the expiry of your stay, and the officer has not made a decision on your application yet, you have implied status in Canada and you may stay in Canada as a visitor. You're not allowed to study or work, but you may stay as a visitor. If the officer makes a positive decision, then based on the new decision, you may stay in Canada. If the officer doesn't make a positive decision, then you're in trouble, and I will tell you how to fix that. But can you submit multiple extension applications? In theory, the answer is yes. You may submit forever requests for extensions. And every time, again, it needs to be before the expiry of the previous extension, and provide documents, make sure that you show them you have financial means to stay in Canada. That's one of the main reasons they refuse the applications. And then if they agree, you can stay. In reality, the first time that you submit an extension, there is a huge chance that they will say yes. Of course, sometimes they refuse, even the first time. But when you submit subsequent times, they may refuse your application. It's more probable that they refuse your application, or they may reduce the amount of time you may stay in Canada. So if the first time they extend you for 6 months, the second time they may extend you for 3 months or 2 months and 1 month and 1 week. So somehow they tell you, please leave Canada peacefully. So you have to be very careful with this extension business. You cannot count on it forever, okay? So what if you suddenly realize that the date that you could stay has passed and you forgot to request for an extension? Or you submitted a request for an extension and the results come back and you receive a no for the answer. So in other words, they say, nope, you cannot extend your stay in Canada. What happens in those two circumstances? From the day that you realize that your stay is over, or you receive the refusal letter about your extension that says that on such and such date your stay is over, from that day up to 90 days, you have the option of applying for restoration of status. The application for restoration of status is more complex than extension of stay. First of all, you need to pay $200 for processing fee instead of $100. You need to provide lots of documents to convince the officer that you deserve to stay in Canada and you restore your status. And also the processing time is a long processing time. Sometimes it could take 4, 5, 6 months. I have even seen more than that. And of course, you may receive again a no. You also need to keep in mind that when you submit an application for restoration of a status, unfortunately, you don't have an implied status anymore. What does that mean? It means that you are here in Canada illegally, and the CBSA officers may come after you and remove you from Canada. It is not customary for them to do that, but regardless, you need to keep that in mind that there is an element of risk for application for restoration of status. Of course, when you know that you don't have a status in Canada anymore, instead of submitting an application for restoration of status, you may decide to leave Canada. That's another option, of course. But if you want to stay, you want to stay. One other thing about extending your stay in Canada is that if you are approaching the end of your stay in Canada, you may also leave Canada and come back. And by leaving Canada, it means that you can go to the neighboring countries. So, for example, if you have a visa to the United States, you may go to the United States, stay there for a few hours or a few days, and then come back to Canada. Or you may go to Cuba or to Mexico or to Caribbeans and stay there for a while and then come back. On the way back, if the Border Services officer realizes that you deserve to stay in Canada, they will allow you to come to Canada and stay, assuming that you have a valid visa to Canada. Remember, when you leave Canada to come back, you need to have a valid visa, okay? They may, of course, ask you lots of questions that why on earth you're just left Canada 5 days ago or 5 hours ago and you're coming back. But if they're convinced that nothing fishy is going on, you don't have intention to work illegally in Canada, or you're not inadmissible to Canada, those kind of things, then they usually allow you to stay in Canada for a while. And again, the same story, by default 6 months, they may limit that or they may increase that based on your situation. Another option for extension is flagpolling. Simply put, and I have another video about flagpolling. If you're watching this on YouTube, I will definitely post a link up here. But generally speaking, flagpolling means you travel by car to a US-Canada border, and when you reach the US border, you say this to the Border Services officer of the United States. You let them know that your intention is not to enter Canada, of course, unless you have actual visa to the United States, If you have the actual visa to the United States, you may just enter the United States. But if you don't, then you let them know that your intention is not to enter the United States. You are there to flagpole. Then what they will usually do, they take you to the office. They may ask you a few questions. Sometimes they keep you there for a few hours. And then eventually they will give your passport back and they will escort you back to Canada, and then on your way to Canada, when you reach the border of Canada, you ask for an extension of stay. Many people find it very time consuming and also energy consuming, because psychologically you need to cross 2 borders in the same day. So that's up to you if you want to do that. I have lots of articles also about flagpolling. You may consider reading those articles as well. While you are here in Canada, can you apply for a work permit? So imagine that you are already here and you go to different employers, they interview you, they find you useful for their firm. Then that employer needs to go through a process called LMIA, or Labor Market Impact Assessment. I have another video, I will post it here. If they receive the LMIA, then you may obviously apply for a work permit, but with some issues that I will explain it to you. Or sometimes if it's LMIA exempted job, they need to create an AR number for your job offer that says it's LMIA exempt. So if you have that job offer, a valid job offer, whether LMIA based or LMIA exempt, then by default you need to leave Canada and apply for the work permit. Okay? There are some exceptions. For example, if your spouse is here in Canada and they hold a valid study permit or work permit, you may apply from inside Canada. Or if you already have another work permit that is not expired yet, or a study permit that is not expired yet, yes, you may apply for a work permit from inside Canada. But if none of those situations apply to you, then you have, other than leaving Canada and applying, you have two options. One option is submit a paper-based application to Visa Application Center in New York. This may end soon, but right now it's available. The other option is that you can basically do flagpole. And by flagpolling, you will receive a work permit at the border. Of course, if the Border Services Officer finds that you meet the requirements. Okay, so these two options are available. What about study permit? The study permit, kind of the same situation. It means that you have admission to a school, university, college. In this situation, you may consider leaving Canada and applying for a study permit, or you may submit a paper-based application to Visa Application Center in New York, assuming while you're watching this video still this option is available. Right now, as I'm recording, it's available. But unfortunately, the flagpolling option is not available to you unless you are a citizen of the United States, or a permanent resident of the United States, or a resident of Greenland, or a resident of Saint-Pierre or Miquelon. You cannot flagpole for a study permit. Okay, so flagpolling is, for majority of people, is not available, but submitting by paper is available. Don't submit the application online because they will refuse you. There are some exceptional situations that you may apply online. For example, if the applicant is a minor who's studying at primary level or high school level, or if you have taken a prerequisite to a course that allows you to enter the college program that you have in mind, then in this case, you can apply from inside Canada or online application. But keep in mind that sometimes the visa officers refuse the application. You need to make sure to mention based on what you are submitting the application online. Okay? I had a case that actually I mentioned the section of the law that allowed my client to apply, despite that the officer didn't even read my cover letter and refused the application. Of course, I submitted this reconsideration request and they reopened the case, but you have to be very careful. If you don't mention that, then the chances that they refuse the application is high. One other option that some people may consider is after entering Canada, you're staying here, can you file for asylum or can you file for refugee? The simple answer to that is yes. But of course, there are so many things behind it, because when you want to file for refugee, obviously you need to meet the requirements of either Section 96 or 97 of the Act. And if you have already applied for refugee status in Canada and that application has been refused or rejected, or you abandon that, then unfortunately you cannot apply for a refugee again. So, of course, this is a very complex subject. If I want to explain it, I need to spend another 20 minutes. That's why I will postpone the submission of refugee cases to another training session. But the simple answer, as I mentioned, for most people is yes, if they meet the requirements of refugee applications. In some cases, you may apply for permanent residency. For example, under humanitarian and compassionate considerations, if you meet the requirements of an HNC application under Section 25 sub 1 of the Act, then you may apply from inside Canada. And while you're waiting for the processing of application, you may request for extensions. And even if you pass stage 1, you may request for a work permit. Again, I will dedicate one training session to humanitarian and compassionate considerations. That's too much for this session to discuss that. So you may also apply for other options for immigration, like provincial nominee programs, Quebec programs, or for example, for express entry, etc. But they do not necessarily help you stay in Canada. Okay, so if you qualify for any of those applications while you're in Canada, you may apply for majority of them. It's just that can you, with the help of them, stay in Canada? Not necessarily. Keep that in mind. But this is also an option for application for permanent residency. So I hope I answered this question, that can you change your status from a visitor to a worker or student or permanent residency. So it's not that easy, but I hope by watching this video you learned your options. I hope that you continue watching my training videos on immigration and visa to Canada. Thank you very much for watching this video. See you soon.